In the summer of 1976, a single poplar tree became the focal point for two of the world's most powerful militaries, as they prepared for a full-scale nuclear confrontation. To understand how this happened, you have to look at the Korean Demilitarized Zone. Stretching 160 miles across the peninsula, the DMZ separates North and South Korea. It is a border held together entirely by a fragile 1953 armistice agreement, meaning the two nations have, technically, never stopped fighting. But at the center of this border sits the Joint Security Area. Unlike the rest of the DMZ, soldiers from the United Nations Command and North Korea operated here inside the exact same perimeter, often standing mere meters apart from one another. It was an environment of suffocating paranoia. Every salute, every overlapping patrol, even the direction a guard chose to stare, was treated as a calculated threat. That proximity created a severe security risk when a tall poplar tree grew thick enough to completely block the line of sight between United Nations Checkpoint Number 3 and a neighboring observation post. A minor landscaping complaint quickly mutated into a high-stakes standoff. Trimming those branches became a rigid test of dominance between two enemies searching for any sign of weakness. On the morning of August 18th, a small United Nations Command work party entered the Joint Security Area. The crew consisted of engineers and laborers carrying axes, escorted by a handful of guards. Their orders were simple: cut back the foliage and leave. Shortly after the work began, a North Korean patrol approached. The senior officer demanded the crew stop immediately, asserting that North Korea's founding leader, Kim Il-sung, had personally planted and cared for the tree. When the U.S. officers refused to halt, the situation escalated violently. "Stop work immediately! That tree is sacred!" Dozens of armed North Korean reinforcements surrounded the work crew. On their commander's orders, they rushed forward, seizing the crew's trimming axes. Captain Arthur Boniface and First Lieutenant Mark Barrett were brutally killed in the assault. The killings sent immediate shockwaves to the Oval Office. President Gerald Ford and his national security team were suddenly trapped in a geopolitical vacuum. They faced two catastrophic options. Launching a retaliatory strike carried the severe probability of igniting a full-scale nuclear war, but absorbing the casualties without a response would signal crippling weakness to the entire communist bloc. Surviving the standoff required an entirely new approach. The administration needed to devise a method to project terrifying, absolute power without pulling a single trigger. Military planners settled on a tactic known as strategic signaling. The objective was not to trade casualties or bomb enemy positions. Instead, the military would amass an undeniable, overwhelming show of force on the border, daring North Korean forces to make the first move. They called the mission Operation Paul Bunyan. The official directive was absurdly simple: send a crew back into the Joint Security Area to finish trimming the poplar tree. On the morning of August 21st, exactly 72 hours after the fatal ambush, the United States returned to the tree with an overwhelming military armada. A convoy of heavy engineering vehicles rolled into the zone, flanked by 64 heavily armed American and South Korean security personnel. Elite South Korean special forces marched alongside them, prepared for immediate close-quarters combat. American commanders were effectively constructing a massive, heavily armed trap around a single tree, purely to test the limits of North Korean military discipline. As the ground teams took positions, the sky above the demilitarized zone began to roar. 27 attack helicopters materialized, hovering directly over the tree line. Above them, F-4 Phantom jet fighters swept across the airspace in tight combat formations. Further up, nuclear-capable B-52 Stratofortress bombers flew high-visibility routes precisely along the border, intentionally positioned so North Korean radar operators could clearly track their approach. On the ground, the psychological pressure was agonizing. South Korean Special Forces operatives strapped live claymore mines to their own chests and stood with detonators in their hands, openly taunting the enemy. Hundreds of North Korean soldiers scrambled to man heavy machine gun positions mere yards away. For several minutes, the two armies stared each other down. Then, the engineers' chainsaws finally tore through the silence. The engineers bypassed trimming the branches and cut the entire tree down to a bare stump. Across the perimeter, the North Korean army watched the destruction. They did not interfere, and not a single shot was fired. Operation Paul Bunyan was executed perfectly, by proving the United States was entirely prepared to engage in total war. They removed the enemy's willingness to start one. Days later, the crisis concluded with a historically rare concession. North Korea's leader, Kim Il-sung, issued a formal statement of regret to the United Nations command. To prevent another fatal clash, crews installed solid concrete dividers directly across the borderline, physically separating the two militaries forever. The era of enemy soldiers sharing the same operational space was over. Operation Paul Bunyan remains a definitive example of strategic signaling, a demonstration that the ultimate expression of military power lies in possessing the discipline to withhold it. Global stability rarely collapses due to grand speeches. Sometimes, the fate of the world balances on the smallest, most ordinary moments, like an argument over a single tree. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden origins behind everyday history, hit that subscribe button and join Origin. Because the greatest stories are the ones you never saw coming.